Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this very nice introduction. And thank you for the Nordic Council for inviting me to participate. I'm very happy to be here today on behalf of the OECD. And I will present some of the results of the OECD Green Growth Strategy, specifically focusing on innovation for green growth. So, why do we need green? I hope I don't have to convince anybody here today that we need green growth. And yet I would like to present some headline figures that I took from the OECD Environmental Outlook to 2050 that was released just a couple of months ago. What is going to happen in the next 4 decades is that GDP is going to grow, and it's actually going to nearly quadruple and arrive at $305 trillion in 2050. But at the same time, world population is projected to increase by 2.2 billion people. And by the way, by 2050, 70% of world population will live in cities, so it will be urbanized. Total energy demand will increase by 80%. And the energy mix in 2050 will look a lot like the energy mix that we have today, meaning that fossil fuels will represent 85% of the total mix. Greenhouse gas emissions are projected to increase by 50% under a business as usual scenario. Biodiversity will decline by 10%, with losses particularly acute in some parts of Asia, Europe, and Southern Africa. And water demand is going to increase by 55%. So given these perspectives, we can see that there are some risks in not going green. We're going to face some bottlenecks in the way we live, in the way we do things, and we've been witnessing some of these bottlenecks already, as shown by the increase in energy cost, by raising food prices in the last couple of decades, but also there are some threats to human living conditions and to the current model of economic growth and development posed by pressure on natural capital, by biodiversity losses, systemic risks, pollution on human health, and so on. So we can see that we definitely need strategies to green our economic growth. And the OECD has provided a framework for its member countries and non-member countries on how we can green growth. And you can see here the main components of these frameworks. We have enabling conditions for green growth, including taxation, R&D and innovation policy, competition policies. We have detailed analysis of the major environmental challenges, and I gave already some ideas of the kind of analysis that we've been doing. We have key targeted policies to green growth, but also measures to ease the transition and making sure that the redistributional impacts that greening growth will bring about are somewhat managed. And finally, we have a very important pillar of the green growth strategy, which is measurement and indicators. I'm not going to talk about all of this today. I'm going to focus specifically on innovation for green growth, and also I'm going to touch upon some welfare and redistributional impacts of the transformation. Innovation will be very important for green growth. Why? Because without innovation, it will be very costly and very difficult to achieve green growth. We have to recognize this. Time is relatively short, and we are facing a lot of inertia. So innovation will be important to ensure that green and growth can go together. But what do we mean by innovation, and particularly green innovation? Well, it's important to underline that we are not only talking about technological change. So we're not only talking about, for example, technologies to mitigate pollution. We're also talking about the whole life cycle of the product. We're talking about industrial symbiosis systems where companies' production systems complement each other, they interact, they use their production cycle cycles, mutually, their waste, their technological developments. And this is why we find that business models are very important for eco-innovation, and we'll hear more about this later this morning, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But I think it's important to underline that recent OECD research shows that business models are the ones that can really bring the more radical, disruptive sorts of innovations, because they really highlight the value of greening growth for the private sector. And of course, we know that the private sector is the real driver of innovation. In the OECD, we did some very detailed econometric work on the impacts of different policy drivers on eco-innovation, specifically on some environmental technologies such as renewable energy, alternative fuel vehicles, and so on. I'm just going to give some highlights of what this research shows. First of all, relative prices, targeted policy measures such as standards, and public support to R&D all drive green innovation, but their impact differs. And the differences are across technologies, but also within the same technologies depending on the maturity of the technology itself. Overall, general innovative capacity and sound market conditions are important determinants, and this is, of course, quite intuitive because they're important for all innovations. And specifically to environmental technologies, stringency of the environmental policy is important. So we have research showing that the more stringent the policy and the more it's likely to induce innovation, but also stability and flexibility are important because they give investors the incentives to innovate in a stable, predictable, transparent environment. Here it's just an illustration of what I mean by differences in the impact of policies on technologies. This is work that has been carried out by my colleagues in the Environment Directorate of the OECD and shows the relative impact of different policies on alternative fuel technologies innovation, distinguishing between electric propulsion system and hybrid engines. And you can see that in the case of hybrids, after-tax fuel prices are the most important drivers of innovation. And basically, innovation here is patents. Patent counts. I mean, it's an imperfect measure of innovation, but it's a good one because it can allow us to carry out very detailed econometric analysis. So you see, prices are very important for hybrids, whereas for electric vehicles, it's the other way around. Standards are much more important, whereas fuel prices are actually not statistically significant. In both cases, public support to R&D is important, but it's not the most important element. And these results basically suggest that for technologies that are closer to the market, such as hybrid technologies, prices can be enough to stimulate innovation. But for those technologies that are further away from the market, further away from being commercialized, and basically are the more breakthrough technologies, we need some more technology forcing approach, such as fuel efficiency standards. These slides basically illustrates the importance of having clear and transparent policy signals. It shows the trend in patenting activities on some environmental technologies, such as wind powers, fuel cells, and so on, before and after the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. As you can see, after 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, patents in environmental technologies soared in the signatory countries. And this indicates that investors believed in the commitment of the signatory countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They found that this was a credible commitment, and therefore they increased their investment in these innovations. Prices are very important. It's important to get the price right. It's important to put the right price on the negative environmental costs. And there's a lot of research showing just that. For example, a much cited example is the tax on nitrogen oxide emissions that was introduced in Sweden. After the introduction of the tax, patents increased, meaning that innovation increased, emissions declined, and the marginal cost of abating these emissions also gradually fell, as you can see in the graph on the right-hand side of the slide. And other examples of the impact of taxation of negative environmental externalities can be found across OECD countries, such as in Switzerland or the UK and many other OECD countries. At the same time, although getting prices right is important, it may not be sufficient. First of all, it is difficult to identify and target the environmental bad, the environmental externality, and it can also involve some very high cost for public administration to administer these instruments. In addition, there are other market failures, for example, knowledge externalities, but also information asymmetries, split incentives, increasing returns to networks that cannot be easily tackled through prices. So we might need some more targeted intervention. There are also some investments that are very high intensive in capital, that are very risky, and therefore providing credible policy signals through prices may not be enough. As I was saying before, we are facing a big amount of inertia in current systems, in the markets, in the economy. And this inertia basically favors incumbent firms, incumbent technologies, and incumbent systems. And basically, getting prices right may not be enough to overcome that inertia. And finally, the evidence from our analysis shows that better pricing may induce innovation, but it's mostly incremental innovation, not so much the radical disruptive innovations that we will need to achieve green growth. And just some example of the big inertia that we are facing. If you look at the lifespan of capital investment in systems that are important to mitigate climate change, you can see that some of them are really long. Going even to the transport system, where the lifespan of capital investment is almost 200 years. So it's easy to see that these systems become really embedded in our way of doing things, and it will be very difficult to shift to a new paradigm. There are also some costs. For example, the capital that has already been invested and that will never be recovered for these systems is estimated at $6.7 trillion. The rents embodied in fossil fuel reserves globally are estimated at $16 trillion. And if you compare this to the size of the world GDP today, which is around $80 trillion, you can see that we are facing a really big amount of inertia that we need to overcome. If we agree that we need some targeted policies, public support for R&D is probably the first that we think about. But if we look at public spending on energy and environment R&D, we can see that in the last couple of decades, it hasn't really kept pace with the challenge. For example, the share of energy R&D in GDP has decreased. This is the dotted line with the smaller dots. It has decreased steadily since 1990. Well, with the reverse on the trend in 2006, but still it's a much lower level than it used to be in the 90s. The same for public investment in environment R&D as a share of GDP. It has stagnated in the last couple of decades. And even within energy technology R&D, investment in renewables, yes, it has gone up from a bit over 12% of GDP, of the total investment in R&D, sorry, to about 25%, but still it's not a very significant share. Having said that, we should also acknowledge that green innovation is not all about public investment in R&D, in energy and environment. In fact, it's much more than that. If you look at the link between innovation outcomes, again proxied by patent counts, and scientific citations, you can see that environmental science and energy represent only 7.5% and 4.9% of total scientific citations, whereas other disciplines, for example, material science or chemistry or others, represent a much higher share. What are the implications of what I just said for research policy? Well, first of all, we might need to reorient R&D spending to the areas, to the scientific disciplines where the most green innovation outcomes are likely to come from. It's probably less important to focus on the big mission-oriented projects, such as the Apollo project, where the main objective was to put a man on the moon no matter what the cost was. Probably for green innovation, it's much more important to look at the commercial applications of R&D expenditure. Because innovation outcomes will come from very different disciplines, it is important to adopt a multi- and interdisciplinary approach. And also, it's likely that the major breakthroughs in green innovation will emerge from competition between the different disciplines and at the same time from cooperation among them. And finally, because of the importance of commercial applications, the effectiveness of funding depends very much on strong interactions between science and industry. So it's important that policymakers nurture these links. Here, I just want to present basically the importance of tailoring policy to the maturity of the technology. Policy intervention can go from supporting research, development, and demonstration in an early phase of technological development, when we're still at the prototype or the demonstration phase, up to, at the top of the curve, promoting the diffusion of more mature technologies and ensuring that these technologies are taken up in the market by consumers. In between these two phases, there's a phase where the curve of market deployment is very steep. And that's where we might have a so-called valley of death, where technologies have already gone past the demonstration phase, but they're not quite yet ready to be commercialized, or if they are, the investment it's just not done. So that's where government intervention is maybe a little bit clear, and it's a bit more tricky. It can involve some technology-specific incentives. It can involve some more technology-neutral but declining support, for example, feed-in tariffs, tax credits, and so on. So what are the implications of all this for support policies? Well, we agree that technology-neutral pricing is important, but may not be enough. So sometimes governments have to be prescriptive, at least to a certain extent. However, this poses some very important challenges. Captured by vested interest, dominant designs emerging, technologies that become lock-in, and then it's very difficult to break this lock-in. Some general principles that can guide the design and implementation of these policies is that policymakers should support a portfolio of different technologies rather than putting all their bets in one technology, because in this way, at least you diversify the risk of getting the wrong technology. We know that there's a lot of information uncertainty, not only on the technological developments, but also on what benefits these technologies will bring. We simply do not know what will be the environmental impacts of some of these technological developments. So it's important to keep a very wide range of options open, and also consider some ancillary benefits that we may not have thought about in the beginning. And finally, it's important to identify general purpose technologies that can support different emission reduction strategies rather than going for very specific applications. Among more targeted policies, we see that there's increasing interest in OECD countries for demand-side policies. These are important because they can foster markets, they can create markets for eco-innovations where these markets are not existing, or where basically the needs of consumers are not converted into clear signals for investors and innovators. And this typically happens when price measures are not sufficient or they're not as effective. Demand-side policies involve public procurement, smart regulation and performance standards, technology standards, and also specific pricing measures, such as fiscal incentives and disincentives, or a combination of the two, such as in fee-based, like the French bonus-malus schemes, and I'm going to say something about that later. However, demand-side policies are particularly challenging for public administrations. They're difficult to implement, and policymakers should be very cognizant of the importance of emphasizing performance and competition rather than supporting specific technologies. We're going to hear more, I think, later about this. So I'm not going to go so much into the details of the different policies, just to say that, for example, public procurement is found to bring significant potential for fostering eco-innovations. In the OECD, we've been carrying out some detailed analysis drawing on case studies coming from different OECD countries, and we see that design is very important, for example, in the UK for commitment procurement process. The same for performance-based regulations and standards. They can help, but design is important. We draw some lessons from the Top Runner program in Japan, where you really provide flexibility and you stimulate firms to try out new ideas, technologies, business practices, rather than being too prescriptive on how they have to achieve the final target. Technology-based standards are also important because they can help overcome the uncertainty and the information asymmetries, and these we know are mostly driven by the private sector, but the government can play an important role as a facilitator and as a coordinator of industry efforts. And finally, just to illustrate a little bit what specific pricing measures can do for eco-innovations, this is the example of the French bonus-malus scheme, which is a fee-based scheme. You can call it a carrot and stick approach to encourage purchase of vehicles that have lower CO2 emissions. Basically, purchases of more efficient vehicles are incentivized, whereas purchases of less energy efficient vehicles are disincentivized. It's possible to make these kind of instruments fiscally neutral, which I think is very important for many OECD countries in this moment of tight public budgets. But again, design is very important. The scheme could have been made fiscally neutral, but the latest report of the French Court of Auditors actually shows that it was in deficit in 2011, so you have to be very careful. But leaving aside consideration of cost effectiveness, we can certainly see that the scheme has contributed to shifting the purchasing behavior of consumers in France. So purchases of new cars have steadily migrated from more CO2 emitting vehicles to less CO2 emitting vehicles, as you can see in the graph to the right-hand side of the slide. Policy can be effective, however, is not always cost effective. And here I'm giving the example of some car scrapping schemes that have been implemented across OECD countries during the economic crisis. This is the example of the prime à la casse that was introduced in France. The scheme did have some important benefits, for example, in terms of fuel savings, of CO2 emissions avoided, of nitrogen oxide emission avoided, and less car accidents on the streets. However, as you can see, the benefits do not outweigh the cost. So there's a net societal cost in this scheme of 300 million euros. The same happened with the Umweltprämie scheme in Germany. Again, there have been some benefits, but the net societal cost is negative. Finally, some words on the distributional impacts of climate change policies. Of course, we're going to have some reallocation of jobs across industries. This shows the results of a scenario where an emission trading scheme is applied for the OECD as a whole. And as you can see, between 2005 to 2030, there will be some significant reallocations across industries. The solar and wind electricity industry by 2030 will gain about 40% more jobs relatively to the business as usual scenario. Whereas in other sectors such as gas, coal, and fossil fuel-based electricity, there will be a loss in jobs of over 30%, even over 35% for gas and coal. So there will be some quite dramatic expansions and contractions. But at the same time, the impact on jobs and the adjustments may not be as widespread as you could think. Why? Because the most polluting industries, the ones that are more impacted by climate change mitigation policies, which are the ones that are here in the gray shaded area, actually represent a very small share of total employment, as you can see from the black solid line, which represents the cumulative share of each industry of total employment share. So especially in flexible labor markets, the cost of adjustment may not be as big as you would think. Even in terms of overall welfare implications of climate change mitigation policies, this shows the cost of greenhouse gas mitigation policies on GDP growth rates between 2005 and 2050, and assumes a 50% cut in greenhouse gas emissions. The blue column shows the decrease in annualized average GDP growth rates for different regions as a consequence of the cost of mitigating climate change. But at the same time, we also have to consider that there are some benefits for the economy, for GDP. I'm not talking about the benefits of reducing the emissions itself. I'm really talking about benefits for GDP, for income, in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For example, in terms of gains of life expectancy. If we include also these benefits in the analysis, and this is represented by the gray shaded column, then we can see that the loss in GDP is actually partly mitigated. And for the United States, there is actually a net gain in welfare. So when we consider the overall welfare implications of climate change policies, we not only have to look at the cost, but we also have to consider all the benefits. To sum up on the whole of my presentation, when we think about the policy mix for green innovation, it is important to consider that there's no silver bullet. We need many different policies. Prices are important because they provide stable long-term signals, but they're not enough. We need some more targeted policies, both on the supply side, so more technology push policies, but also on the demand side to pull the market. Competition between technologies is very important, and it's very important because it can help to ensure that we don't get into a lock-in, that we don't support a technological trajectory that it's basically suboptimal, that in the end it's not the best one. And once we get locked in a technology, it's very difficult to get out. So we need to support a broad range of options, including general purpose technologies. There are some challenges for governments in implementing these policies. You have to provide predictability for investors, but when information is basically imperfect and when information is constantly changing. You need to provide a mix of incentives that induce solutions both from innovations that are close to the market, but also to break through more radical innovations. And of course, the incentives are different. You have to provide both. Technological change has to be directed into a green trajectory, because if policies don't do it, they won't do it alone. But at the same time, we have to avoid being too prescriptive, so we need to strike a balance there. And finally, it's important to build international cooperative solutions for environmental problems. My very last slide is just to inform you on some forthcoming work on green innovation that is coming from the OECD Committee on Industry, Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which is the committee for whose secretariat I work as well. We have 3 reports coming out this year. One is on the role of demand-side policies for eco-innovation. One is on business models for systemic eco-innovations. And the final report is on market development for green cars. So this concludes my presentation. I thank you very much. And if you want more information, you can find all the details here. And of course, I'm also happy to take any question you might have. Thank you.